Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey into the world of feudal Japan, a place often painted with graceful cherry blossoms and stoic warriors. But while those things were part of the reality, the daily life for most people was profoundly alien and unforgiving. It was a world where tradition held a timeless sway, and every routine, every social expectation, was designed not for comfort or individual happiness, but for a system of relentless submission, quiet obedience, and precision. Honestly, it's a place where a modern person would be absolutely broken by lunchtime. The very first truth you have to accept about this elegant, but crushingly inescapable, world is that your path in life was not a matter of choice. It was determined entirely by the family you were born into. You don't wake up and choose your destiny. It's already been chosen for you by your birth, by your blood, and by people who've been dead for 6 generations. Your role in society isn't a suggestion, it's a lifelong commitment. Were you born into a samurai family? Well, congratulations, you're one of the tiny ruling elite. You're now responsible for the blade, the bow, and learning 10,000 ways to sit properly in front of your lord. Born a peasant, the reality is you'll be spending the next 40 years ankle deep in mud, from sunup to sundown, and your children will be too, forever. Your existence is a combination of sweat, dirt, and back pain. In this fixed hierarchy, known as the Shiniki Sho, or the 4-class system, there was no resume. There was no starting your own business to climb the ladder. You were either a samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant, and once you were placed, you stayed there for life. Movement between these classes wasn't just frowned upon, it was strictly forbidden and often punishable by law. You didn't climb the ladder in feudal Japan, you bowed to it, and we haven't even gotten to the very bottom yet. Below the 4 main classes were the Ita, or untouchables. These were the people who performed tasks society needed but found impure, like butchery and leatherworking, which were often related to death. They were needed, but they were treated as if they didn't exist. They were like ghosts with very important jobs. Now, a powerful cultural contradiction existed within this system, especially concerning the merchant class. You'd think being a merchant would sound pretty decent, right? You've got coin, and you can buy things. But despite their wealth, they were actually ranked at the bottom of the 4 main classes, below even the peasants. This was a fundamental part of the moral and economic system. Since the economy was based on rice production, a person's value was tied to their direct contribution through labor or service. Merchants, who accumulated wealth by trading goods without engaging in that direct physical labor, were seen as profiting from the work of others, which was considered morally questionable. Meanwhile, peasants were taxed so hard that they often had very little left to eat after the harvest. Hiding rice to survive was treason, and heads often rolled for it. Meanwhile, the iconic samurai lived in constant fear, not of starvation, but of a different kind of punishment, a profound, soul-crushing dishonor that could be brought on by even a misplaced sneeze during a tea ceremony. Women, of course, were not exempt from any of this. Whatever your class, your freedom ended precisely where your father's opinion began. They were expected to marry who they were told to. Obey those they must, and thank the heavens if they were even allowed to learn poetry. A samurai daughter, for example, might be married off at 15, expected to master needlework and the art of never expressing disappointment out loud. So, you were born, assigned a costume, given a script, and pushed onto the stage of society whether you wanted to perform or not. The daily routine, the social expectations, it was all designed for a system of relentless submission. It was an elegant, poetic, and crushingly inescapable world. And that was all before you've even had breakfast. Now, you might picture feudal life as a mix of grit and grime, but Japan took cleanliness very seriously, even with a near-religious fervor. It sounds lovely until you experience it in winter. Your day would begin not with a hot shower, but with a frigid splash of water from a stone basin. There was no heating and no negotiations. You just shivered as if the ancestors were punishing you for having pause. The use of soap was a luxury reserved for the rich, and even then, it was often an unfragrant concoction made from ash. But a closer look at the period's beauty practices reveals a culture of refinement that existed even with limited means. Historical accounts show that soaps were crafted from an array of natural ingredients, including milk, seaweed, clay, charcoal, and persimmon. This meticulousness, even in something as simple as a bar of soap, demonstrates that the culture valued precision at every level, from the most elaborate ceremony to the most basic task. For those in rural areas, the local bathhouse was a vital communal center. You'd bathe next to your neighbors, your boss, your future in-laws, and maybe even your landlord, completely naked and in silence, pretending this wasn't incredibly awkward. You scrubbed first, then soaked. There was absolutely no privacy whatsoever. In this culture, cleanliness was sacred. Dirtying the bathwater was not just a social fox pass, it was social suicide. Being unclean was seen as shameful both spiritually and socially. You washed your teeth with salt or a twig and kept your clothes regularly aired, not because it was trendy, but because it was a matter of honor. If you were a samurai, this pressure was multiplied tenfold. Your lord might inspect you from head to toe at any moment. Dirty fingernails were a sign of dishonor. A wrinkled robe was considered disrespect, and having too much body odor during a bow meant you might not get back up again. You were one eyebrow twitch away from an existential catastrophe. For women, bathing was a ritual, and skincare was practiced with military precision. Hair was maintained in elaborate styles that took hours to create. All this was so you could work and still look dignified doing it. Women were expected to smell like cherry blossoms and discipline. So yes, feudal Japan was clean, very clean, but it came at a price. It meant freezing water, endless grooming, and the constant, soul-shrinking awareness that someone was definitely judging your foot hygiene. You had to be a walking embodiment of refinement and discipline, and it was exhausting. Now let's talk about the samurai in more detail. We romanticize them with their fancy swords, silk robes, and poetic sword fights under cherry blossoms, but being a samurai in feudal Japan wasn't about shouting for honor and swinging a katana. It was about never, ever screwing up. Their lives were governed by bushidō, or the way of the warrior. This code of conduct was so strict that even their ancestors were nervous. You didn't live for yourself, you lived for your daimyo, or your lord. His word was law, and your job was to serve him with such unwavering loyalty that you'd rather die horribly than disappoint him mildly. Disobedience, dishonor, failure, dishonor, raising your voice inappropriately or looking at the wrong person sideways during a tea ceremony. You guessed it, dishonor, and dishonor wasn't something you could simply walk off. It was something you were expected to atone for, usually with your own intestines. This was seppuku, the ritual suicide. It was not a private act of despair, but a public, ceremonial demonstration of unwavering loyalty and self-sacrifice. It was a respected, even celebrated, way to preserve dignity. The ritual was performed with great formality, often beginning with the samurai drinking sake and composing a death poem. A critical detail was the presence of a kaishakunin, or second, typically a trusted friend or relative. Their role was to decapitate the samurai the moment they made the first cut into their abdomen. The purpose of the kaishakunin was not merely to make the death quicker, but to ensure it was a clean and honorable end, preserving the samurai's dignity and protecting the honor of his family and clan. The fact that a friend or relative would perform this gruesome task underscores the extreme, unbreakable nature of the bonds of loyalty in feudal society. It demonstrates that a person's final moments were a communal responsibility. Being a samurai wasn't about glory. It was about discipline, silence, and surviving each day without blinking wrong. They were expected to train constantly. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, strategy, calligraphy, poetry. All of this was done while maintaining a perfect posture and the expression of a person who had never known joy, just a deep sense of obligation. Laughter was unrefined. Showing fear was a sign of weakness. Getting emotional was shameful. Your clothes were precise, your sword had to be spotless, and your conduct was expected to be so honorable it made other people uncomfortable. You looked good in armor, but you were just one eyebrow twitch away from existential catastrophe. While the samurai faced the weight of honor and disgrace, the peasant faced the soul-crushing reality of relentless physical toil and taxation. Your entire existence was a combination of dirt, sweat, and government-mandated rice delivery. You didn't have to worry about seppuku, which was the good news. The bad news: you were a peasant. You'd wake up with the sun, not because you were one with nature, but because the land tax didn't pay itself. Your thatched hut had no doors, no windows, and someone's goat might just walk across your bed mat. Then it was off to the rice fields, which sound peaceful in travel documentaries but were, in reality, mud pits designed to break your soul slowly over 12 hours. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was a bowl of rice porridge. If you were unlucky, it was pretending you weren't hungry with a splash of river water. Your diet was mostly rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, and rice for dinner. If you were lucky, it was actual rice. If not, it was barley pretending to be rice, with maybe a turnip or some pickled radish if the gods were in a good mood. Meat was for the powerful. A peasant's existence was a combination of sweat, dirt, and back pain, often from sunrise to sunset. They were legally bound to their village and forbidden from leaving without permission, effectively turning them into a rice-based prisoner. You were the foundation of the economy, the reason the samurai ate, and the person everyone forgot existed. Taxes were relentless. You didn't get paid in coins, you paid with rice. The rates were so high that peasants often had very little left to eat after the harvest. Historical records show that these tax rates varied widely across the country, ranging from a staggering 70% of the yield in some areas to as low as 15% in others. This highlights the massive discrepancy in quality of life from one region to another. While the idea of a peasant speaking out was a fast track to death, the historical record presents a powerful contradiction. While official requests for tax forgiveness were often ineffective, large-scale peasant rebellions and mass desertion were, on occasion, successful in forcing samurai rulers to lower tax rates. This small crack in the system reveals that feudal society was not a perfect totalitarian machine. The sheer weight of a massive, unified population could exert a form of political force from below, transforming the peasant from a passive victim into a figure with a sliver of desperate agency. It shows that the system was, in a way, designed to endure, but it wasn't immune to the sheer force of a united population. In feudal Japan, meals weren't about indulgence, they were about survival, simplicity, and not choking on a fishbone in front of your in-laws. And heaven forbid you got food poisoning. Medical care was optimistic. The local remedy was to lie down and think about your ancestors. You'd either get better, or you'd become one of them. Food theft was a serious crime. Steal a bowl of rice, and you weren't just getting a slap on the wrist. You were getting a public display of why we don't touch the daimyo's food. Even though meals were considered sacred, they were mostly bland, small, and contained at least one crunchy mystery item. And no, you couldn't complain. For the samurai, food was a controlled ritual too. They did get better food, but they also ate last, after their lord, his guests, and anyone he felt like impressing. This meant cold rice, cold soup, and the eternal joy of watching other people eat, while pretending you're deeply honored to wait. Everything was seasonal, not because it was trendy, but because there was no refrigeration or global supply chain. If you didn't harvest it yourself, it probably didn't exist. So, when it was winter, that was just nature's way of suggesting fasting. Free speech was not a concept in feudal Japan. Your opinion was a liability, a fast track to disgrace, exile, or sudden career-ending decapitation. The social hierarchy was so rigid that every single word had a profound weight. Speaking above your class was seen as impudence. Criticizing someone above you was insolent. Making a joke that didn't land was treason adjacent. You had to tread carefully. Even within families, a son did not interrupt his father. A wife did not correct her husband. And absolutely no one questioned the daimyo, unless they... Samurai were trained to speak with a measured calm, even when furious. A sharp tongue was considered worse than a dull blade. It was unbecoming and dangerous, and it might force someone into the awkward position of having to kill you just to restore their own honor. Apologies were an art form. You didn't just say sorry, you bowed, you groveled, and you possibly wrote a poem about your shame. You might even send a gift while sincerely hoping the person receiving it didn't decide to kill you anyway. Gods help you if your tone was too casual. A misplaced word could be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or spiritual wrath. Silence was almost always safer. Even humor was a tightrope walk. Laughing at the wrong thing could be seen as disrespect. Laughing with someone important might imply you thought you were on their level, and that's how people ended up mysteriously reassigned to the far north. It was a culture where efficiency was viewed with suspicion and where a misplaced word could be interpreted as spiritual rot. So, yes, you were free to speak technically, but in practice you learned to nod, smile, and pray your opinion never tried to escape your mouth. Because in feudal Japan, loose lips didn't just sink ships. They sank social standing, reputations, and sometimes your entire bloodline. In this society, fashion wasn't about self-expression. It was about making sure everyone knew exactly how far below them you were just by looking at your sleeves. Your clothing didn't reflect your personality. It reflected your position, your purpose, and whether or not you were legally allowed to carry a sword without getting tackled by a samurai. A samurai's layers of silk robes, sometimes armored, were always dignified and carefully arranged to signal status and readiness. The colors, deep blues, earthy browns, and the occasional blood-red flourish, were elegant and ominous. And of course, the swords, a samurai's daishe, the paired long and short swords, were more than a weapon set. They were a walking badge of authority. Peasants, on the other hand, wore cotton and humility. Brown, grey, and beige dominated their wardrobe, not because they were minimalists, but because dyed fabric cost money and they were too busy surviving to worry about coordinating hues. Their outfits simply said, "Yes, I work in mud. No, I didn't choose this lifestyle. Yes, these are my only sandals." Merchants wore finer materials since they had money, but they were still ranked socially below even the peasants, so they kept their clothing muted. They were experts at looking just respectable enough not to draw attention from a bored samurai on patrol. And then there were women. They had to strike a delicate balance between grace, obedience, and wearing layers of folded symbolism. Hairstyles were coded and kimono patterns were seasonal. If you wore a color meant for a different festival, you just dishonored your entire household and possibly started a neighborhood whisper war. Feudal Japan isn't about moonlit walks beneath cherry blossoms or dramatic kisses between a samurai and a forbidden princess. Love was a side quest you were unlikely to complete, a kind of dangerously inconvenient emotion. Marriage wasn't about feelings, it was about alliances, status, and not embarrassing your ancestors. For a peasant, a partner might be chosen based on their fickle endurance or strong teeth, qualities seen as essential for a lifetime of back-breaking labor in the rice fields. Romantic compatibility was never discussed. For a samurai, marriage was a political calculation. It was a tool to solidify a clan alliance, secure land, or pay off a grudge with a strategic union. The goal wasn't happiness, it was stability, true romantic love, the kind with stolen glances and passionate declarations, was largely confined to poetry, theatre, and tragic ghost stories. If you wanted to experience love, you watched a nun drama about two doomed lovers who turn into mist. If you tried to step outside your assigned relationship structure, you were on a dangerous path. Adultery could lead to exile, disgrace, or death by sword. The punishment might even be carried out by your spouse, your lord, or your in-laws. In feudal Japan, death wasn't a distant concept. It was your neighbor, your co-worker, your roommate who never pays rent but is always around. You didn't plan for retirement. You planned for your exit because death was part of the script. The samurai walked around with a personal death plan. If they lost a battle, committed a dishonorable act, or even spilled sake on their lord's robe, seppuku was expected. It wasn't private, it was a public, ceremonial act performed with the same precision as a tea ceremony, but with significantly more internal bleeding. But don't think peasants had a longer life. If you were a farmer and the rice harvest failed, you were starving. If your village couldn't meet its tax quota, your head might be used to make a very stern point. Your life was a constant dance with sudden demise. From drought to plague to bandit raids, nature itself was a disaster artist. Earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis could destroy your home at any time. The only insurance policy was a well-tied roof and deep spiritual acceptance. There was no famine, no national relief effort. If your house collapsed, you rebuilt it. Wailing in fear or fighting fate was considered undignified. You were expected to accept it all calmly. A real hero bowed before death, composed a poem, and met their end like it was just another awkward dinner with the clan. In modern life, we are told to follow our dreams and be our own person. In feudal Japan, the individual didn't matter. The clan did. You existed not as a lone star of destiny, but as a very small branch on a very important family tree. Your actions reflected on your father, and his actions reflected on your grandfather. It was a web of obligations so dense it might as well have been a spiritual spreadsheet. One poorly timed affair, drunken incident, or public poem with too much sass could bring shame to your entire bloodline. Your mother would be mortified, and your great-uncle might have to disembowel himself just to restore the family's good standing. You were not a person, you were a representative, a chess piece, and a liability with legs. If you played your role well, bowed at the right times, and married who you were told, your clan might just speak your name with something resembling pride. And that, in feudal Japan, was the ultimate version of a personal achievement badge. The beautiful, aesthetic, and poetic aspects of feudal Japan were not the result of effortless grace, but of a discipline so tightly woven that it could snap bones. It demanded a respect so absolute that it swallowed individuality whole. The simplest aesthetic act, be it arranging a vase of flowers or folding a kimono, was governed by strict, generational codes of conduct. It was an elaborate, high-stakes performance with serious consequences. The society was not designed to be easy, it was designed to endure. The very essence of modern life, individualism, free expression, the pursuit of personal dreams, was anathema to the feudal Japanese way of life. A modern person would be a walking liability. They'd fail to bow at the right depth, speak too loudly, or ask a question. These were the kind of transgressions that would mark them as a problem. Deviating from the norm wasn't seen as brave or courageous, but as a dangerous threat to the established order. Any one of these slip-ups could jeopardize not just their own life, but the reputation of their entire clan. Now, shifting gears completely, let's talk about Artemisia of Coria. In an age where women were barely allowed to speak in public, let alone command an army, she existed like a historical glitch. She was someone who, by all the rules of ancient society, should not have been possible. And yet there she was, seated on a throne, plotting war alongside some of the most powerful men of the ancient world. She was a queen and a naval commander, and she didn't simply inherit a political position, she made it dangerous. She was a woman who dared to think like a man, and better than most of them. She was Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, and a woman by biology. Each identity carried immense weight in a world dominated by iron and testosterone. Upon her husband's death, instead of stepping aside for a male successor, Artemisia claimed the reins of power. That alone was an act of quiet defiance. But she didn't stop at ruling, she wanted to conquer. So, when Xerxes the Great launched his legendary invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia did something no other woman of her time dared. She volunteered for war. She did this not to stitch bandages or offer prayers, but to command ships and risk death. She supplied 5 of her own sleek, fast, deadly vessels and led them personally into the thick of battle. And Xerxes, the ruler of an empire stretching from India to Egypt, didn't just tolerate her presence. He valued her advice and listened to her. He found in her something he rarely encountered in his court full of brutal warriors and sycophants. It was a bold move. A Greek fighting for Persia was seen as treasonous, and a woman on a warship was unthinkable. But Artemisia knew what she was doing. She wasn't motivated by loyalty to bloodlines or empires. She was playing the game of survival and power. She played it better than most of the men around her, and she dared anyone to stop her. By siding with Xerxes, Artemisia effectively declared war on her own people, the Greeks. It was a decision that raised eyebrows, and to the Greeks, she was a traitor in fine robes, a queen turned mercenary. But she didn't seem the least bit bothered. She sailed into the campaign like she belonged at the high table of Persian power. Xerxes, who was used to flattery, found in Artemisia something rare: blunt, piercing honesty. In council meetings surrounded by decorated generals, she spoke with a clarity and strategy that was rarely wrong. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and often laced with warnings others were too proud to voice. Before the infamous Battle of Salamis, she urged Xerxes to avoid a direct naval confrontation with the Greeks, correctly warning that the cramped straits would nullify Persia's numerical advantage. She argued that the Greeks had superior maneuverability and familiarity with the terrain, but Xerxes, intoxicated by numbers and pride, dismissed her warning. He wanted a spectacular victory, and what he got instead was humiliation. As the battle raged, chaos swallowed the Persian lines. Ships collided, formations broke, and it was a slaughter. It was here that Artemisia would make one of the most shocking tactical moves of her career. With a Greek ship pursuing her relentlessly, she ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel, one from an allied king. The move was so unexpected that the Greek fleet, assuming she must be on their side, stopped chasing her. She was a Greek fighting for Persia, but to save herself. She had just attacked an ally. She slipped away, untouched. Xerxes, watching from a hilltop, supposedly witnessed this and exclaimed to his aides, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was perhaps the highest praise he ever gave a subordinate, especially one who had just sacrificed a friendly ship to save herself. But her move wasn't just about survival, it was strategy, misdirection, and cold-blooded calculation wrapped into one. She read the battlefield in real time and made a split-second decision that saved her ship, her crew, and possibly her own life. It was controversial, it was brutal, but it worked. The Persian fleet limped back from Salamis, humiliated. For many commanders, this was the beginning of the end. But for Artemisia, it was a strange kind of triumph. In the middle of a disastrous campaign, she emerged as the lone figure of competence, and Xerxes still trusted her. He asked for her advice once more. He asked her a deeply personal question: what should he do next? Artemisia, ever blunt, told him exactly what no proud emperor wanted to hear: retreat. She urged him to return to Persia and leave his trusted General Mardonius in charge of the remaining campaign in Greece. "Don't push your luck," she essentially told him, and incredibly, Xerxes listened. The man who had ignored most of his war counsel followed the advice of a single woman. It was a moment that confirmed she wasn't just brave, she was politically lethal. Her power didn't come from brute force, but from clarity and foresight. Artemisia's legend began to take root in the minds of those who recorded it, especially in the pen of Herodotus. Known as the father of history, he just so happened to be born in Halicarnassus, the very city she ruled. This geographic coincidence gave his account an almost eerie intimacy. He wasn't writing about a distant myth, he was writing about his queen. And yet, Herodotus didn't present her as a caricature of feminine virtue or a simple villain. He painted her as something much rarer in the historical record: a competent, calculating, and compelling leader. In his work, Artemisia becomes a contradiction, both admired and feared, respected and suspected. Artemisia didn't fit the cultural mold of her time. She wasn't a feminist because the concept didn't exist, but she undermined the patriarchy through her competence alone. She didn't seek to rebel, but she disobeyed. This kind of wisdom was rare, and even rarer coming from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility. For all their noise, the men of her time ended up needing scribes to keep their memory alive. Artemisia had something better. She outthought them in war councils, outmaneuvered them in battle, and outlasted them in politics. She knew when to fight and when to vanish. Strangely enough, the name Artemisia didn't vanish after her death. About a century later, it returned in the form of another queen, Artemisia II of Caria. A namesake and likely a descendant, she also ruled Halicarnassus. While the second Artemisia never commanded fleets in battle, she carved her name into the bones of history, quite literally. Her claim to fame was building one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The name Artemisia had by then become synonymous with power, intellect, and bold rule. The legacy of the original queen had seeped so deeply into the identity of the city that future generations wore it like armor. Artemisia's story has always lived in the in-between, between empires, between genders, between legend and history. She was a sovereign playing chess while others were busy swinging swords. Her legacy wasn't built on vanity or myth-making. It was shaped by hard, controversial, but often right decisions. She defied the lines that war tried to draw, and even modern historians and readers alike continue to wrestle with what she represents. A feminist icon before feminism. Maybe. A symbol of shrewd leadership in a world built to exclude her. Absolutely. Her legacy continues to fascinate not because she fit the mold, but because she cracked it open. Now, let's turn our gaze to a different part of the world, to ancient China, where astronomy wasn't simply a science. It was a matter of state. The emperor, regarded as the son of heaven, ruled with the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement that could be revoked if the stars sent the wrong message. This made astronomy both sacred and political. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were meticulously tracking celestial events and documenting them with methodical care. They recorded comets, novae, eclipses, sunspots, and planetary motions. Some of these records are still referenced by modern scientists today to verify ancient astronomical phenomena. Perhaps most remarkable is their documentation of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE. It was visible in daylight for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded its location with such accuracy that modern astronomers used the data to identify the remnants, now known as the Crab Nebula. In ancient India, astronomy, known as Jyotisha, the science of light, was never a separate discipline. It was interwoven with philosophy, ritual, and mathematics. It began as a tool for determining auspicious timings for rituals, but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced systems of celestial observation in the ancient world. Indian astronomers developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar introduced much later by the Romans. The Surya Siddhanta, a foundational astronomical text, describes the Earth's axial tilt, elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity centuries before Newton. The most revolutionary figure in Indian astronomy was Aryabhata. In 499 CE, he proposed that the Earth rotates on its own axis daily, a theory rarely entertained in other parts of the world at that time. He also calculated the length of the solar year at 365.3 feet 8 days, just a tiny fraction off from modern values. Indian astronomy wasn't just poetic. They saw the universe as a cycle, a dance of time and space. Understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the self. For them, astronomy wasn't about dominating nature, it was about harmony with it. Now, for something completely different. In 1803, something unprecedented happened. A young republic, barely 3 decades old, bought a landmass so vast it doubled its territory overnight. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a real estate deal, it was a geopolitical thunderclap. With the stroke of a pen, the United States acquired more than 828,000 square miles of land from France. The price, a cool $15 million, which was roughly 4 cents an acre. What makes this even more extraordinary is that no one, Not even the Americans saw it coming. At the time, President Thomas Jefferson had one goal: to secure access to the Mississippi River and the crucial port city of New Orleans. The young nation was heavily dependent on river trade, and Jefferson authorized diplomats to offer France up to 10 million just for New Orleans and some nearby lands. But when those diplomats arrived, they were blindsided. The French, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had a counteroffer: the entire Louisiana territory. Napoleon had dreams of a grand North American empire, but the Haitian Revolution had crushed French ambitions in the Caribbean, and he needed money for war with Britain. Napoleon's vision of a grand North American empire had collapsed in fire and fever. The Haitian Revolution, led by formerly enslaved people, had erupted into full rebellion, and France lost thousands of troops not just from battle, but from yellow fever. With the richest sugar colony slipping away, Louisiana became irrelevant and, worse, indefensible. He feared Britain might seize it, so in a typically fast and bold move, he sold it. In his own words, he had given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. This unexpected opportunity gave Jefferson a huge constitutional nightmare. He was a strict constructionist, believing the federal government should only use powers explicitly stated in the Constitution, and nowhere in that document did it say the US government could buy foreign territory. There was no legal roadmap for doubling the size of the nation in one go. Jefferson wrestled with this contradiction. He considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase, but he knew the clock was ticking. If he delayed, Napoleon might change his mind, or Britain might seize the territory. So, he did something ironic. He bent his principles and rationalized the purchase as a treaty, which the Constitution did allow him to make with Senate approval. The Senate ratified the deal, and Jefferson, while privately uneasy, defended it as necessary for the survival of the Republic. The Louisiana Purchase was signed, sealed, and ratified, but nobody really knew what the US had just bought. The land was vast, sparsely mapped, and filled with unknown rivers, mountains, and people. So, in 1804, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition that would become one of the most iconic journeys in American history, the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was ambitious: explore the new territory, establish trade with native nations, and most importantly, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They dreamed of a Northwest Passage that would revolutionize trade, but it didn't exist. Still, what they brought back was arguably more valuable: a detailed account of the new land and the people who lived there. One of the most essential figures on the journey was a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. She wasn't just a translator, she was a symbol of peace. Her presence with a child signaled to native tribes that this was not a war party. Her knowledge of geography and diplomacy helped the Corps survive dangerous crossings and build crucial alliances. While the purchase was a triumph for America, it was the beginning of an erasure for the native nations who already lived there. The land the US had purchased was home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with its own language, territory, and system of governance. They were not consulted in the deal, notified, or compensated. In the eyes of Jefferson and future US leaders, the Louisiana Territory was a blank canvas. The native nations who lived there suddenly found themselves declared subjects of the American Republic. Jefferson believed they would either have to assimilate or relocate, peacefully if possible, but forcibly if necessary. This pressure intensified after Lewis and Clark returned with news of abundant land and natural wealth. The Louisiana Purchase marked the start of a new phase in US expansion, what would later be called Manifest Destiny. It was a belief that the United States was destined to control the continent, and its moral cost was paid in the lives and lands of native nations. The Louisiana Purchase also intensified a moral crisis that would eventually fracture the nation's slavery. Southern leaders immediately saw the vast new lands as an opportunity to expand plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern parts of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as essential to making it profitable. This raised an explosive question: would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The answer would haunt Congress for decades. It led to the Missouri Compromise, which drew an imaginary line across the purchase, allowing slavery south of it and banning it to the north. That single line would haunt American politics for decades and eventually contribute to the Civil War. The land was also transformed by the arrival of American settlers. This led to a range of environmental consequences. Rivers were dammed, the plains were plowed, and the buffalo were nearly wiped out. What had once been a landscape shaped by indigenous stewardship became a patchwork of farms and fences. The land that had once been an open and interconnected indigenous world was now being chopped into rectangles. Congress passed laws to organize the territory, first as military districts, then as organized territories, each with governors appointed by the federal government. These borders were not just lines on a map, they were tools of control, ways to claim, divide, and sell land. As maps were being filled in, they were also erasing native trails, seasonal migrations, and indigenous names, and replacing them with names like Jefferson City and Fort Pierre. With one diplomatic stroke, the Louisiana Purchase redefined America's identity. The United States went from a coastal republic to a continental power stretching toward the unknown. It was the first great leap of manifest destiny, even before the term existed, and it set the tone for the next century of expansion and conquest. The purchase established the legal precedent that the federal government could acquire new land through a treaty, even without clear constitutional guidance. That precedent would be used again and again with Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. The US became not just a country, but a collector of territory, a nation always looking westward. It fed a new American myth of the frontier, a place for rugged settlers, daring explorers, and wide open possibility. But for every pioneer's dream, there was a native nightmare, a memory of land lost, treaties broken, and people pushed further into exile. Economically, the impact was staggering. The Mississippi River became the artery of American commerce. Cities like St. Louis and New Orleans grew into vital trade hubs. The fertile plains turned into farmland, and the discovery of natural resources would turn portions of the purchase into engines of industrial growth. Ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase stands as a paradox. It represented American ideals of opportunity, growth, and independence, but it also embodied America's deepest failures of dispossession and imperial ambition. It's a story of triumph written on land taken from others, often violently. It made the United States what it is today, but it also forced a reckoning that continues to this day. It was a story of growth and grief. The ink dried in Paris, but the consequences echoed across prairies, rivers, and generations. The US was forever changed by it, and so was the world.